and we'll take questions at the end. So I'd like to introduce our presenter for the webinar, Lois Engelbrecht, Dr. Lois Engelbrecht. Lois is a founding consultant through to live. Say hello, Lois.
Good morning, everyone.
I don't know how many of you saw our Facebook post from yesterday, which I think makes this webinar even more relevant today, because they were talking about child sexual abuse in madrasas. And it's just not madrasas which have the problem. Any place where children congregate is going to have issues of heightened vulnerability and risk which need to be contained. So over to Lois in addressing institutions.
You really need to see me all the time?
No, that means you can take Lois's camera off.
Because it's blocking my vision to the PPT. Okay, to start with, most of my experience is working with international and some institutions in the Philippines and even a few are in India. So please keep that in mind when I present some frameworks of research and experience that you're going to need to understand and be very critical in how you can use this information to fit your own. Okay, first of all, what is child protection? Okay, because child protection is a broad term that describes our philosophies, policies, standards, guidelines, procedures that we want to protect children from intentional as well as unintentional harm. What's really important to this definition also include harm to self. Can I ask a poll?
Sure.
Just let's do a quick poll. Oh, you have to write it down? I just want to know how many have child protection policies in their organization. Yes or no? Yes. How many of you have child protection policies in place already?
Okay, so they can answer the question that clearly.
Okay.
Yes, in prayer. PPL doesn't have, Army, so a few people have, a few people don't have.
Okay, so those of you who have, please feel free to write in any advice at the end pertaining to what works and what might not work here in India. Okay, now I borrowed this from an international school, and I feel it's very, very important because of the need to focus on our student. Very often our organizations like to focus on protecting the organization rather than protecting the school. Rather than protecting the student. And I feel if you work on protecting the student, you will automatically protect the school. However, if you focus on the school, that does not mean you will automatically protect the students. So here is a very good student rights statement that I suggest you can use. All students expect and deserve to be safe. Agency is committed to protecting students from harm. All children and young people are vulnerable to abuse by adults in authority, and as such, they need to be empowered and encouraged to speak up about a concern that arises. It requires great courage for children to report concerns or incident of any form of abuse. It is extremely important that institutional staff take student issues seriously at all times. I grew up in a boarding school, and I know how difficult it is for children in institutions to speak out. So we need to find ways in our own policy and in the way we treat children to help them speak out, not necessarily if they're being abused, but for any concern that a child might have. So children and young people need to be made aware of their rights, and this will be a part of your policy statement. Everything you do, please base it in research. Don't just cut and paste. although cutting and pasting isn't a bad idea to begin with, but then you need to do a lot of work to revise it to fit you. But research-based frameworks, I like to use the Save the Children framework because it's very broad. You have to base your policy on laws that protect children from abuse and neglect. Okay? What are the laws in your country, not only in your country in India, but in your state and in your community? Then you have to have a central government coordination mechanism, something in your area where you have child protection units, departments, civil society, hospitals, whatever. You're going to get anyone involved with child protection. There has to be some kind of coordination mechanism. Okay? But then you have to have effective regulation and monitoring at all times. You can't just have these rules and these relationships just sitting there. And then, of course, in order to have implementation, you need a committed workforce. And they have to be trained, they have to, and they have to have mandates. Okay? Now, let's not forget that a functioning child protection system should be informed by children's views, children's voices, their experience, as well as the strengths that they bring in. Everything should be based on the child's voices and the child's perception. This is not just about adults coming in and saying, this is what children need. It is also about understanding how children perceive what you are doing with them and to them. Okay? Now, this is based on the ecological model of child abuse and neglect. Again, I like to base everything on research. And there are several. You can also look at David Finkelhor, Finkelhor. He has a model for child sex abuse. It's a very good one that you can use for individual cases. But for setting up a child protection policy in the institution, I like to use the ecological model. And here, what I want you to focus on are what are the community factors? What the community being your institution. And then around it, of course, you have to understand the family, and then the individual child. And then, of course, your community will be within some kind of cultural understanding and values and beliefs. Okay? Now, this is what, and don't go crazy when you see this. This is what your policies can be based in. These are all the particular components of a cohesive and holistic child protection policy. Now, this again is focused on a school, so please look at it and see what things. Try not to throw anything out. Rather, add what you may need or tweak what would fit for your institutions. Okay. So you need, your policy has to be linked to local, national, international law. Then you have to state what are the components of that policy, and then it has to be grounded in your own values. We'll do these one by one, so I'm just going to skip over this quickly. I like this. This is the ecological model. Everything has to be within something else, the individual within the relationship, within the community, within the social. Okay, so when you write your policy statement, please don't make it more than 3 short paragraphs. It will be based in the law, and it will be based in your institution's values. It does not have to be anything out. It merely is a statement. However, the 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 pages will be about the implementing of the statement. But the statement is still very, very important because you cannot implement something that is not founded in the policy. So, for instance, you forget to say something about family values, and you just only say, we're going to keep children safe, blah, 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 and you don't mention the family. But later on, when you're trying to put all of your services in place, you realize that you can't really work with children without understanding family values. But it's missing in your policy statement, which could mean there are people who say we can't do this because it's not in our policy statement. So then you would need to go back to your policy statement and revise it and just add not a whole nother paragraph, but a short phrase, so that what you're going to do with families is also a part of your 3 short paragraphs policy statement. There's a lot of mistakes about policy statements. People like to make it 3 pages, 4 pages long. It should just be very short, concise, to the point. Okay? So, but beyond your values and your institution, it has to be based in law. So you have to know the law. You have to know how to report when the law is broken. You have to know where to get help from the law for suspected cases of child abuse and neglect. Okay? Know how to seek assistance from the child welfare and particular authority. Know what services are available around you. You cannot do everything in your institution, and you should not be doing everything. If you try and do everything, even the children tell you all of their problems and it never goes anywhere. You're just like in a very large incestuous family. Children need to go out and get help elsewhere so that they can talk about their problems within your organization. And then, of course, know the medical sources for the medical legal concerns. Very basic. Okay. Now, part of your policy is you're going to state your definitions of abuse and the symptoms of distress in your community. I'm going to go through this really, really quickly because you should already know all of these. Okay, so for instance, you're going to state what is physical abuse. You're going to state what are the signs of physical abuse. Now remember, you have to know your own population. If you're dealing with physically handicapped children, there could be different physical signs than if you're dealing with healthy ambulatory children. Okay? So what is emotional abuse? Again, this is going to be cultural. However, don't make it so that the culture allows a certain misbehavior. I've been in several cases where someone will just tell me, oh, well, Lois, that's Indian. Oh, Lois, that's Filipino. And therefore, that allows certain abuse to continue because the big C culture is more important than anything else. So then what are the signs of emotional abuse? Again, this will be social, as cultural, as well as economic and even gender. Okay, what is sex abuse? What are the signs of sex abuse? Okay, again, these will be very community-based. And neglect, the persistent failure to meet a child's basic physical or psychological needs. If you're running an institution, an organization, an orphanage, these children will be neglected in some form, but not necessarily because their parents don't want to work with them. Many of our children are neglected because of poverty, so it's not necessarily an emotional neglect. Children understand why, but nonetheless, they're still neglected. So here are some indicators of neglect. Okay. Now, our children are only with us for a short time, but we need to work with them today, so you need to understand what is the long-term impact of child abuse. Okay, so again, you should know this, so simply going. Now, if you're in orphanages, I don't know how much you deal with the families, but if you're not in an orphanage or you're working with children who still have families, it's really important to understand the family symptoms of abuse. Unavailable parents. Unavailable parents, not because they're too poor to come, but also psychologically unavailable, and they choose not to come. Parents who minimize problems with the child. Okay, now sometimes the parents are overworked and they're overstressed and they can't deal with the problems. But you will be able to determine which parents are those parents and which parents are those who simply don't want to believe the child and are part of the whole abusive system. There are parents who will blame their children for the problem. Parents who give reasons for the problems that don't coincide with the symptom, such as, you know, a father says a child fell down the stairs in the home, but there are no stairs in the home. Or there'll be a big cigarette burn on the child, and they'll claim it's because of something else. Okay. But you'll also have parents who are overly controlling or overly protective of their children's lives. And these are also possible symptoms of abuse. Okay, because remember, abuse impacts everyone, not just the child, but also the family, and also our whole community, and therefore our whole country. Now, one thing when you're working with an institution is you have to look out for children who are potential offenders. Most children in institutions are they're not angels. They're troubled in some way. If they're not emotionally troubled, then they're missing their parents. There's some reason why they're there, and so these are children are more at risk to become potential troublemakers. They're not bad children. They're just going to be making mistakes. So we need to work with them to help them understand so that they don't become what might be referred to as the bad child, okay, the actual young offender. So you need to understand what are the early warning signs of these children, and you need to also have very strict rules for behavior of your students. Just like we'll talk later on the behavior of the staff, you need to also have strict rules behavior of the students. And you need to supervise. This is very important. These children need supervision. Okay, so what are some of the signs, early warning signs in a potential young offender? They have an unusual interest in sex. So they're sexualizing inanimate objects and activities. Okay, an unusual interest in sex. Sex is a part of all of our lives, especially adolescence. So you need to determine what is unusual and what is normal, but it should still be handled. Because a lot of these children, because you don't talk about sex at all, ignoring their need for understanding sex could lead into an unusual interest in sex because they're learning it from somewhere else. Okay? Now, for those children who are having sexual questions and you answer them, but they still continue to have sexual misbehavior even when they're told to stop, this is a sign that there's a problem. Okay? Potential young offenders also will use force and coercion in social situations. And very often they will have friends who are younger than them, those who are less powerful than them. And you'll notice an unusual intensity when they're talking about sex and sexuality. It's not just giggling and fun. There's some seriousness in them. Okay, and they're going to give gifts, require secrecy in relationships. Now, I don't know what the age of discernment here is, 9, 8, 7. Okay, so we really need to work with our children, especially our boys, to help them stay out of trouble, because it could mean that we're putting our children as young as 8 and 9 in prison, even if it's in juvenile detention centers, and that's just going to put them more at risk to become offenders. Okay. So let's look at what are the signs of an adult offender. And this is, we're going to be looking at your staff. How do you help not hire staff who are potential offenders, or even if they're not offenders, have misbehaviors that put children at risk? So let's first look at what are these signs. Okay. You have a staff who has a favorite student or child. Okay? They don't treat everyone equally. This is a red flag. Okay, so they try and find ways to be alone with children, to be alone with that particular child. They have inappropriate language, jokes, and they talk about sex with students and children, but they're talking about sex in an inappropriate way. Okay, they might be bringing in pornography if they're really not. They have sexualized talk in the presence of students. Okay, they'll talk to boys about how a girl's anatomy looks like, for instance. And if a girl walks by, they'll be a part of the boys doing eve teasing. And of course, giving the private gifts or as private chats on Facebook, internet, or whatever, because this is the favorite child. They're grooming that child for a possible. Screening employees. How many of you have steps for screening employees? Do you have steps for screening employees? So I have to type the question. They can type in the question. The question is, yes, they type in the answers. I got it. Okay, please type in the answers. Yes or no?
most people have some sort of gatekeeping, not entirely robust, but some form of gatekeeping.
Okay. Most organizations, they look at your background. Are you qualified? They ask people who are their friends or people who they've put down there as their referees, and of course, whoever the potential employee puts down is going to be a friend of theirs and is only going to say good things. And we forget to ask questions such as, has there ever been any kind of question of any kind of misbehavior with children of any kind? Saying any kind, make it very broad. Talk to people who are not on the list and ask them these questions. I'm having an argument with a school right now who 20 years ago hired a teacher who brutally beat children. And he was there for a long time, and then he left. And now they're bringing him back again. And they didn't have child protection policies before, but now they have child protection policies. So I asked them, did you do a robust screening, or did you just let him come back because you already know him? So ask some possibly embarrassing questions. They're not easy to ask. But once you hire them, they must sign this code of conduct. And this is a simple example of a code of conduct. And this is for a school. So it's pretty broad. I think it can be used for institutions. And it also has to be Indianized, okay? Which means you also have to have guidelines for behaviors of how there's, and code of conduct can be 2 or 3 pages long, because you also want to provide some very specific examples of what is acceptable and what is non-acceptable, because a potential offender or any intelligent person trying to get out of being caught can easily twist words into, well, there's no rule about this, therefore I didn't know, or this is what I meant, okay? So here are some basic things. I, Lois Engelbrecht, promise to strictly follow the rules and guidelines in this code of conduct as a condition of my providing services to the children and youth participating in this particular program. So I will treat all children and young people with respect regardless of sex and status. Okay, what is treating them with respect might have to be clarified. Okay, provide a welcoming and safe environment for all children and young people. What is the definition of welcoming, and what is the definition of safe environment? Encourage children and young people to speak up about issues that affect them. And of course, then that means, we'll talk later about the training. You're going to have to train these staff how to listen to children. Refrain from using corporal punishment on children, and use positive reinforcement rather than criticism, competition, or comparison when working with children. Again, this means that all of your staff are going to have to go through training on positive reinforcement. Is there a law in India? Are they still allowed to have corporal punishment in institutions?
Not really, no.
Not really, no. Okay. But you can make your own law. Okay,
There is a law.
There is a law.
There is a law, but it's not really implemented.
Okay. So part of when you send these policies, you have to make sure you also have consequences for breaking it. Otherwise, they're useless. Okay. So immediately report concerns or allegations of child sex abuse. The Haven of Grace, this was for a church, so report it to the pastor, to the parent. So indicate who they can report these issues to and cooperate with the investigation. Now, when you look at the ecological model, you will see that you have to be connected to the outside, otherwise you are just like a incestuous family. So this is how do children who have problems in the organization that are not being addressed, how can they go outside of your institution and report it to outsiders? Okay. So you want to comply with all laws, and that whenever possible, another adult is present when working with children. Okay. So I will not use inappropriate language whether of an offensive, discriminatory, demeaning, abusive, or sexual nature. I think one very clear thing is if it's anything sexual, don't do it. Okay? Engage in behavior to shame, humiliate, belittle, or degrade a child or young person. Okay? Or otherwise emotionally abuse a child or young person. I got into an argument yesterday with someone, an Indian, who was saying, but ma'am, in India this is okay. I think we need to review that. In India, is it really okay to do some of these behaviors? So don't put the big C culture as an excuse. Put the big C out there to critically understand. Okay, number 3, I will not act in a sexually provocative manner. I will not hold, kiss, or touch a child in an inappropriate, unnecessary, or culturally insensitive way. Okay? I will not give a child who is not my own a ride home. This is especially for teachers. I will not accept gifts from or give gifts to children or youth. And I will not engage in private communications with children via text messaging. So this is just a base from which you can develop your own. And of course, they will sign it. And it confirms that I have read this code of conduct, and that as a person working with children and youth, I agree to follow these standards. I understand that any action inconsistent or failure to take action may result in disciplinary action. So of course, part of your policy will be how to report these incidences, how to handle them, and what is the disciplinary action for each of them. Okay? So let's go back to this big thing, this big policy, and let's talk about training. When you have a policy, everyone has to be aware of it. It cannot just be in a book collecting dust in the bookcase. Okay? So first of all children have to know what the code of conduct is. All children have to know what the policy statement is. As a Christian, I often work in churches. And in the Christian church, we have this commandment that says, honor your father and your mother. Okay? And this is something that we all do in all the world. We tell the children, honor your father and your mother, respect your parents. Parents are always correct, blah, 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 blah. However, this is only half the truth. Because the other half of the truth is really parents, treat your children properly. So as long as we teach children only that they're supposed to respect adults, and forget to teach children that adults are supposed to treat them properly, we're not a child protective and a safe environment. So you have to educate children on what is the policy, what are the expectations of how they're supposed to work with you, because you know as a child how you're supposed to deal with adults. You're told that all the time. And what are the rules about each other? The touching rule, never all right for someone to touch your private body parts, sexuality, all of these things. So there's a lot of things you need to teach children that they're not going to be taught in school. And so you have to decide who will do it. And that will be a part of following screens. Okay, you decide you have to have someone in your organization who can work with students with this. Okay. Then you have to have, oh wow, something's missing. Okay, what is missing there is when you work with, students, you have to also have a code of. I tried to get online and find some of the code of conducts, and the only ones I saw were for college students. But you can look at what are expectations of your children. Many times you have rules for all of these children in your institution. Don't, and not enough do's. But pull out some of those or add those that have to do with particularly child sex abuse, misbehavior, between bullying, those things. And they can sign it, because again, you're educating them about what the rules are for clarity. Okay, and then you want to work with parents. Everything you do should involve parents, as long as there are parents, because parents are primary educators, and even if children are living in your institutions, they will still look to parents at times. Let me just ask quickly, the question is, do you have a program to work with parents? Do you have a program to work with parents on child protection?
So, yes, no. Yes, no, no. Not we still have that. Not no. No, more no than yes.
Yeah. Okay. So this is something really important because if you're a school, the children go home at night. Okay. If you're an institution, an orphanage, the children don't go home at night, but many of them go home on holidays, or they might be adopted or whatever. They're going to be living with a family after they leave you. So you have to work with parents because they're going to reinforce the lessons. And if they don't have their own education about child abuse, they're not going to be able to follow whatever policy you've asked the children to follow. So how can you work with parents? Well, you're going to have policy, a school policy or an institution policy. Personal safety curriculum. Personal safety is teaching children about prevention. You're going to teach children how to handle disclosure if a child comes to them with a problem. How can you listen to them and not demean them? How can you believe them? And where can the parent go for help? Where can you get the help for your child? Networking with other parents is very, very important, especially in cultures where we have big families and communities. Then, of course, if you're a school, we have parent take-home letters. The problem is many schools and organizations will say parents will not read these, parents will not come to meetings. That's true, but you still have to try. Okay, so what you need to include in this advocacy for parents, they have to understand what is the policy. They have to understand where the resources they are, and you want to provide parents with information for how to keep children safe. Okay?
Talk about domestic violence is extremely important in this position. It's school for violence, so it's likely to
domestic violence and abuse issues. Yeah. Children will be as equally impacted by witnessing domestic violence as at being sexually abused. So just even witnessing domestic violence has a huge impact on our children. Okay. So I think I've gotten too many slides about concepts to include in training of parents, but you want them to know the signs and systems, the statistics, the awareness of the risks, vulnerability of our students, okay, and especially how to talk with your children. Now, this is where I want to get to. Training of your instructional staff, training of your institutional staff. What do they need to know? Okay? They need to know the specific policies and procedures of your institution. And in order to understand these, they need training and awareness of the issue, signs and symptoms, vulnerabilities of the students, the statistics, developmental levels of children, and I added with a focus on sexual development because that is often missing. And of course, my expertise is sex abuse, so I will always put that in there. You want to train them in how to handle disclosure, how to report, networking, who to report to. You need to understand the lesson plans, and what I mean by the lesson plans is what is the information that you're teaching the children. Okay, so they need to reinforce that. And then, depending on time and the depth of the contact, you also need to work on individually assessing role play so that they practice doing this, because the most important thing is practice, practice, practice. And so I would urge you to make the time for the practice and talking with children, the practice for handling disclosure, practice for even saying the sexual parts of our body. I found in India this is very interesting, the different ways that people respond, because it's so difficult to say some of these words. And the impact of not being able to say those words has on children who need to talk about someone touching these parts of their bodies that no one wants to talk about. Okay? So in order to do this, in order for this policy to be implemented and to be successful, you have to set up support teams for it. Okay, this is very important. And this is where you might have to hire someone in particular, or make sure that someone in particular has a specific job description to cover these. Okay? You need an institution-based child protection team. Okay? I'm suggesting you have at least 3. So you have an institution-based child protection team, someone who already works there, who is going to be especially trained, ongoing training. Everyone should be trained at least 1 year, but this team will be specifically trained. They'll read articles throughout the year. They'll go to conferences, whatever. Okay? Then you'll have an institution-based response team. So if there's an indication or an allegation, this team will come together, and they're only from the institution. So you're going to have to decide who's going to be on that team. But then you need to have a multidisciplinary team of professionals outside of the organization, because they can help you look at an incident more objectively than you. Remember, you do not want to be an incestuous institution. Okay? So here, your child protection coordinator, you have to have a clear job description. They have to maintain contact with local resources. You want them to know the law, you want them to know the services, you want them to know the systems. Okay? And they're going to facilitate the institution-based community meeting. I can hear someone speaking. Okay. And they're the ones who are going to set the agenda for these 2 meetings. Okay? And the meetings will be planning, the meetings will be what training is needed, how are we going to work with children, what posters should we put on the wall because there are certain issues that our children are not listening to, how do we get the code of conduct signed, all of these housekeeping things. Okay? And then the case management team only comes in when there is a reasonable cause to believe. Most of the cases, hopefully, your institutional staff will be able to handle. You know, fighting among the children, minor stealing. But then you have to decide when the organization alone cannot handle it. And maybe the organization can handle part of it, but you will have to refer the child out for counseling if there's depression, if there's any kind of psychiatric issue, if the fighting with the other children gets too bad, okay, they can be referred out for some kind of counseling. But then there is a time when the agency has to just have nothing to do with it and refer it out completely, and this is whenever there's an allegation of abuse by one of your staff. Okay? And so you need to determine in these case management response teams, is it case A, B, or C? And if it's A and you can handle it, you can handle it. If it's case C and it needs to go out, then you need to refer to your you need to refer to it outside and mandate that you refer to outside. Okay? So here's a sample reporting flow. Does this look like what you? Yeah, it looks okay. Disclosure, and of course this is for a school. If there is reasonable cause to believe, who you referred to. Okay. Okay, so if a child comes to you, let's just go through this quickly, because really when you do handling disclosure, you really need to do a lot of practice. And so I'm just going to tell you this, and I would like you to hold on to it and actually practice it with all of your staff. So why do you have to understand why children don't tell? And we know why children don't tell. There are many reasons that they don't tell. What I think people least understand is that they might like the sexual relationship. They might like either the sex or they might love the offender. Okay, so they're not going to tell because they want it to continue. Sometimes they're also protecting the offender. It's very interesting how children will protect their parents. So there's shame on behalf of their parents. They feel guilty, it's their fault. They also worry that they're not going to be believed. And this is actually a very valid concern. They also worried that nobody else is experiencing this, and therefore no one will understand it. The stigmatization. And of course, then there are those children who say they can deal with it. And many children can deal with it, but some cannot deal with it. So what are the fears? Again, why don't they tell? If they tell, you know, this becomes true. Very many times the abuse, what happened to them is pushed way back in their memory. and they deal with it by thinking it was a dream or telling themselves it really wasn't true. And so by actually telling someone that it happened, it becomes true. And once it becomes true, that's where often the trauma begins. So again, they're afraid if they tell, their offender won't love them, their mother won't love them, their friends won't love them, their pet dog won't love them because they're bad. It's their fault, the shame and guilt, it's their fault. Other people who look at me will say I'm damn as good. Other people will look at me as bad. No one will like me. Okay, but also they're afraid of the harm. Not all offenders. Offenders do impose some kind of secrecy. You know, don't tell anyone because of this or that. But very few of them actually have to say, if you tell, I'll kill you. Very often what it is if you tell, I won't love you anymore. If you tell, your mother won't love you anymore. Your father won't believe you. They don't have to use the physical violence, but nonetheless, there are those who do use the physical violence. And not necessarily against a child. They can say, I'll kill your mother. Okay? And of course, children are going to communicate in several ways, and this is also how you have to train and educate your staff on looking at what kind of behaviors indicate that there's a problem. Okay? And sometimes they'll come to you with a direct disclosure, this happened to me. Sometimes it'll be an indirect disclosure, well, this happened to my best friend. Okay, and then of course there are the strings attached. If I tell you something, do you promise not to tell? And of course we can never promise not to tell. So what are some common responses? First of all, you don't believe the child. Okay, simply you don't believe the child. You know the person and you cannot believe that that person would ever do it. Oh, and this child always wants some attention. But then maybe you kind of believe it, but you're afraid it's not a real case. So you won't go take it further. Okay, you believe it, but you blame the child. You know, the way the child behaved, the way the child dressed. The child didn't say no. The child should have known better. Okay, so the child's to blame. All right, but the next is maybe you believe the child, but tell the child to keep quiet because telling would make things even worse. Next is you believe but think you can do better, but because you don't trust the authority or others. This is where a lot of institutions are. The child will tell me, and I can do better than the police or the social welfare, and very often you can do better than the police, by the way, but nonetheless, it has to be reported out. Otherwise, you're an incestuous institution. But I can do better, and therefore I'm going to handle it. Okay, maybe you believe, but your subsequent actions make things even worse. Okay, you're angry, you're disgusted, you rush to the police, and the children can't handle this yet. And so, yes, you make things worse for the child because the child's needs are lost in your need to report it. And then you believe and respond appropriately. So how should you respond appropriately? Always believe the child. Even if the child is not telling a true story, you have to believe it in order to understand what the true story will eventually be. For instance, a child might tell you that a monster comes into her bed at night. Well, you'll say there's no such thing as monsters. In fact, the monster is her father. And so if you don't believe that a monster comes into her room at night and the monster lives in the closet, then you'll never be able to find the truth of who that monster is. Okay? And you want to respond calmly and matter-of-factly. It's hard to respond to incidents of sex abuse calmly because we all want to be really angry and we want to be disgusted, especially we want to be angry. But once you behave with these kind of emotions, the child takes the emotions on themselves rather than, and is more likely to say nothing than to continue. So when you respond as though it was just something else, it makes it matter of fact and is everyday and helps the child move forward. Okay? And you want to affirm their feelings, including their bravery to tell. However, affirming their feelings doesn't mean labeling their feelings. So if they're crying, don't assume they're crying because they're sad. If they're laughing, don't assume that they're laughing because they're being vindictive or happy. Okay, we show our feelings in different ways. So you can affirm a feeling, affirm their feeling by asking them how they feel and, you know, yes, this is normal. And then you have to report it to someone, so you have to talk to the child about what the next step will be. you want the child as much as possible to be part of the next step, depending on their age. And then, of course, you want to make the first report to your child protection outside team. Here's an example of making a report. I know many institutions have really long, complicated reports, but all you really need to know is who was the offender, what you heard from the child, and if there was any previous incidents or events or symptoms. Now that the child has told you this, have you noticed anything else? Okay, and this is the final thing. What does your multidisciplinary team look like? As an institution, don't isolate yourself. Have good code of conduct. Have a good screening process. Have a good, what's it called, a buddy system that all colleagues have to help each other keep straight, keep positive behaviors. And if you see someone with improper behaviors, how can you help them behave appropriately? And so you don't, hopefully you won't have to use this outside multidisciplinary team, which should be someone from mental health, someone from law enforcement, someone from medical, someone from school, especially if your children are going to school, and certainly a social worker who can help put this all together. Now, the multidisciplinary team is not going to actually handle the cases. The multidisciplinary team is your advisory committee and will help you look at things more objectively than you as an institution, so that the child's voice can be heard as much as the adult's voice, and the adult's voice can also be heard as much as the child's voice. So that is the end of my session.
You can type in the question.
Please type in your questions.
What if a child requests you 1 minute? Not to tell anyone.
Okay, if the child requests that, you should not tell anyone. You have to tell them you cannot make a promise like that. Okay, tell them something like, I really care about you, and if this is a problem that I can't help you with, I want to find someone that can help you, but I won't tell the whole world. You know, I'll only tell that person who can help you. However, when you teach children personal safety, this should already be a part of helping children, that when they tell you, cannot keep it a secret. So they should be prepared for you to say, I cannot keep it a secret, but I will keep it confidential. So only those people who need to know will know.
Okay. With mandatory reporting being the law in India, is it the best with mandatory reporting being the law in India? How do we deal with that situation?
This is where an MDT would be, a multidisciplinary team would be very helpful. Because yes, you have mandatory reporting, and like in the Philippines, we have mandatory reporting, but we do not necessarily report everything wholly, but we report things partially. For instance, okay, a child comes and says, my father's doing this. And so mandatory reporting means I have to go and report it to social welfare. But the child says, I do not want to go to police. I do not want my father arrested. I just want the abuse to stop. So you go to social welfare, and without a child who is willing to speak, your case goes nowhere. So we've had cases where the social worker says, I'm going to take it to court anyway, because the law says you don't need the child to speak. But still, the case won't go anywhere, so the child won't speak. So you need to look at, when you talk to your multidisciplinary team, find other ways that you can help stop the abuse, and find other ways to get justice, and help the father or uncle or whoever not do that anymore. So you need to have discernment. And mandatory reporting is still quite new in India, so there's still a lot of things that you need to discuss and get over.
Okay, so what do you do when the civil services are obligated? When you just have a under your mandate, child helpline. So you need to be creative and
yeah, you need to be creative. you know, in my experience with international schools, where in places like Saudi Arabia and countries where there's absolutely no English spoken, even if there are services, you can't use them. So be creative in finding people in your community who can help you with these issues. And again, find justice for the child in a way that if you listen to the child, you can find a way that will help everyone.
In a research center which works with children but not on a continuous basis, how do you address situations which might arise? How do you empower the child then?
In a research center?
Yeah, for instance, there are centers for research on children, but they don't actually work with children, they only research with children. But in that relating with children, if they come across case reviews, how they deal with them.
Oh, so you're doing research and one of your recipient or one of your participants has abused, yeah.
Or 100% research center staff will abuse kids or...
Okay, if it's abuse, if it's a staff member, you need to report it immediately to the director. But if it's like a child who is saying they're abused outside of the research center, you need to find someone. Yeah, that's a difficult one because yeah, who would you report to? In the United States, you would report it to someone and it wouldn't go anywhere because you know they might find the child, or you know if you've actually. The best thing to do is if the child tells this to you, you stop your research and you talk to the child right away and you get more information and you help the child find someone who they can talk to. And that's the best thing to do. And you can ask the child, do you want me to help you report this? And if they do, then you have to stop the interview and you have to help the child.
Okay, so the next question is how do we work with parents in addressing this issue?
How do you work with parents? There are lots and lots and lots of ways, so it depends on what your institution is. If you're a school, there are opportunities to have parent-teacher things, sending home letters, sending home pamphlets. Whether they read it or not, of course, is another thing. In institutions, if you have children who have parents, parents can come in, but how do you work with parents? In family counseling, you know, the best way to work with parents, I found, is to put them in support groups. You can have it with a social worker who guides it, or you can have it as a facilitator parent. But if you can put these together in your community and allow parents to come in, have community sessions of this training or that training, and so that they look like churches. Churches is a good thing. You know, you have things. How do you discipline properly? What is the new law on sex abuse? How can you help your child? So actually, how do you work with parents? There are 3 million and one ways to do it.
Okay, so this is a PT teacher of one school who was found behaving inappropriately with children. Then moves on to another school, and the correspondent of the new school contacts the correspondent of the former school, and she says no such background or complaints of such behavior. What do we do? The principal of the new school says he's very famous and knows and views all the new school. So in case of so what do you do then?
Okay, what I've done is I've contacted the board of directors. But you first have to have your own statements by people who have been abused. So you have to have some kind of proof. You can't just go say this student has to. So if this child was doing it in the other school, you have to get some statement from that other school. And then you can take it to the head of school, to the board of directors, and maybe the media.
Okay. So people want to know, this is actually very... Hi, this is Vidya. I'm reading out the questions to Lois, and Lois is, rephrasing the question as part of her answer. But I'm not sure whether, but apparently some people still want the questions read out. So the next question we have is, what if there is an allegation of abuse in a school? And there are two scenarios. If the parent wants to file a complaint and the school doesn't, can the parents still go ahead and file a complaint? And the second part of that question is, if the school wants to file a complaint and the parent doesn't want to file a complaint, then what does one do?
You answer that. That's an India question.
Okay, this is Vidya again. So I just like to tell you all what happened with us in a situation like this with mandatory reporting. I think it's really important to understand what would be the liability factors as well. So in a particular school where a teacher in a school had abused a number of children, both as part of school activities and outside of school but related to the school, we have explained to the school that there is a mandatory obligation in their part, but also to keep in mind the best interests of the children concerned. So in this instance, the school invited the parents of these children, met with them, explained what happened, and asked them that, that it is part of the law to report abuse, and that the school would like to report the abuse, and what does the parent feel about it. And there was one way in which we dealt with the situation, because every parent didn't want to file the complaint, or the children. These were not young kids who you can make decisions from, but these were teenagers who also had to be participating in their decisions about their lives. And in this case, the teenagers also said they didn't want to make a complaint. And so every parent gave a letter to a school saying that we would like some action taken, but we do not want a formal complaint filed with the police. The school then also brought us in to work with the kids to assist them getting back to their stage of equilibrium. But there was no police complaint filed. The school terminated the man. The man has got a job in a new school. We're aware of that. The school has informed the new school as well. And in fact, I wish all schools would behave like this. The school is even organizing a meeting of all the schools in and around that area which follow the Board of Education to talk about situations exactly like what I described as to what would a new school do when somebody from another school joins them. Will the new school then have a more exhaustive kind of conversation with the old school to find out under what circumstances the man left? You have to be very careful in these instances that there could be allegations or charges brought against the older school saying that you're trying to defame me. So you have to tread very carefully, and it's very important to consult with legal counsel in that school before taking this forward. I'm sorry that's a very long answer, but this is from an actual case which we're handling, which I thought to share with you.
It's a complicated issue.
It is a complicated issue, and there is no silver bullet answers. I think one needs to be aware of that. One needs to be creative. One needs to work with the kind of context you have. But most important, please remember, the best interest of the child involved has to be kept in mind at all times. And that is of paramount importance, and even though there's mandatory report. That's something which Tulira as an organization believes in, and I just thought I should put it out there. Nancy, do we have any more questions? We have one more question, and I think this will be the last question we'll take before we sign off. We're already past time.
Just while she's finding the question, I just want to put in, I believe in mandatory reporting. However, I do not believe that mandatory reporting means that you have to always go to the police. I believe in mandatory reporting and that you have to do something. And the fact that there's a law that says mandatory reporting really should just push us to do something, but not say we have to go to the police, we have to go to the law enforcement, but that we have to do something. And yes, always keep the child's best interest at heart. In the Philippines, we have mandatory reporting, but we've been able to find ways to help the child and report it in a way that does not have to go to court. Father does not have to be arrested, whatever. There are other ways.
Okay, one of the comments we've received is the response system. That is, police, lawyers, judges need to be more sensitized in handling CSA survivors and their supporters, especially for the non-offending parent who's reported the abuse. Oh, we completely agree with that. We need to understand that we are talking about a context where sexual violence has only started becoming part of even the conversation among child rights groups only in the last 10 years or so, or less than 10 years. So and we also need to understand that worldwide, sexual violence against children, especially child sexual abuse, within the larger overarching area of sexual violence against children, really started being researched and being considered a separate area of concern and redress only in the last 20 odd years worldwide. So I think we need to understand that there's going to be a time of shakedown. There has to be, you know, after all, the police, the lawyers, and judges are from society. And if society is in denial about abuse, you're hardly going to be able to get a very appropriate response, even though they professionally are mandated to respond. Okay, the next question is, how can we make institutions more accountable to the community? Do you think that will help in responding to child protection concerns? Do you understand?
There's another question. What if abuse is also a child?
Yeah, and I think this is an important question. Is what if the abuser is also a child? How does the institution respond to it? In our experiences, institutions just suspend the child for a week. That doesn't really address the sexually offending aspect of the behavior of that other child. So would you like to talk about fear and peer abuse in institutions?
Well, we talked about this in the last webinar, how to handle children's sexual misbehaviors. And yes, you know, you should have bullying. This is again the code of conduct and what are some of the consequences for certain behaviors. But you know what? You have to have trained staff. You have to have staff who also are comfortable with their own sexuality. Because when it's a sexual misbehavior, it becomes very difficult and very embarrassing to handle. But really, you should be able to handle it just like you do any bullying. The problem is when it's sex, it becomes very embarrassing and difficult. So you should attend, get notes from last week's thing on handling, because it's a very long question to a very long answer to a short question.
Yes. And I think it's very important that there's no point just suspending a child who is offending against another child, but that offending behavior has to be addressed appropriately. And this is, yes, it's a minefield by itself, because you're dealing with the child who was abused, his parents who are probably, you know, screaming blue murder, and then you're dealing with a child who's allegedly abused. You're dealing with that family, which most probably is in complete denial that their child wouldn't have done anything. So you do need to have, it is a very delicate situation, and keeping the interests of both children in mind, this is a good idea, as Lois says, is to have an NDT together, because in these sort of situations, more minds could help come up with a solution to that particular situation happening in the school.
But there are two things, okay? Number one is supervision. These children would not be behaving like this if they were properly supervised. Number two, appropriate sex education. A lot of this behavior is out of curiosity that goes bad. So those two things, supervision and appropriate sex education.
So, okay, folks, thank you very much for attending today's webinar. We will be sending out the PowerPoint